The story opens on Earth in the year 2247, at the Deep Space Monitoring Station orbiting above the Pacific Ocean. Captain Marcus Patterson stood before the holographic display, watching the cascading data streams flow across the luminous interface. The station had been picking up strange signals for the past 6 hours, but this one was different. This one was a distress beacon. Marcus leaned closer to the screen, his jaw tightening as the encrypted message repeated itself over and over. The signal originated from the Kepler sector, a region of space that humans had only recently begun to explore. It was 3 weeks of faster-than-light travel from Earth, and whatever was sending this plea for help was doing so in the universal distress frequency that all spacefaring civilizations understood, regardless of their origin. Henry Brooks, the station's communications expert, looked up from his terminal with concern etched across his face. The distress call had been running on a loop for nearly an hour, which meant the sender was either completely automated or desperate enough to keep broadcasting despite the danger of being detected by hostile forces. Marcus knew that protocols dictated they report this immediately to Admiral Linda Hayes at Earth Defense Command. However, protocols had been written in a time when humanity's understanding of the galaxy was far more limited than it was now. The fact that someone out there was calling for help in a region of space humanity had begun to map suggested that first contact might be imminent. Admiral Linda Hayes listened to Marcus's report with the calm demeanor of a military officer who had served through 3 different galactic crises. She studied the holographic map of the Kepler sector, noting the vast emptiness that surrounded the coordinates from which the signal originated. The United Nations Space Force maintained strict protocols about engaging in first contact situations, but those protocols also mandated response to distress calls from any source. After a tense moment of consideration, Admiral Hayes made her decision. She authorized the assembly of a rapid response strike force, and she designated Captain Marcus Patterson as the commanding officer of the expedition. The news spread through Earth Defense Command like wildfire. Within hours, personnel across multiple military installations began mobilizing. The battleship Sentinel, a state-of-the-art warship equipped with the latest human military technology, was pulled from routine patrol duties. 3 destroyer-class vessels, the Phoenix, the Endeavor, and the Valor, were redirected to join the mission. 2 support vessels, the Mercy and the Logistics Hub, were assigned to provide medical and supply support. Marcus personally selected his command staff. Lieutenant Colonel Vincent Drake, a tactical genius with experience in rapid deployment scenarios, became his second in command. Dr. Patricia Lawson, the chief medical officer for the United Nations Space Force, volunteered immediately when she heard about the mission. Henry Brooks requested to join as communications specialist, and his request was granted without hesitation. As the crew assembled in the briefing room of the Sentinel, Marcus addressed them with the gravity the moment demanded. They did not know what they were flying toward or who had sent the distress call. All they knew was that someone needed help, and humanity had the capability to provide it. The crew was composed of some of Earth's finest soldiers, scientists, and support personnel. They had trained for deep space operations, combat scenarios, and first contact protocols. Now they would put that training to the test. The briefing concluded, and the fleet received its final clearance for departure. Within 6 hours, the assembled strike force was moving away from Earth orbit, setting course for the Kepler sector with all weapon systems armed and ready. The journey through the void of space took exactly 23 days. The crew spent the time reviewing protocols, conducting combat drills, and preparing for scenarios that ranged from simple rescue operations to full-scale military engagement. As the fleet approached the designated coordinates, the sensors began picking up multiple energy signatures in the area. What they discovered would change the trajectory of human history forever. Emerging from the darkness of space, the human fleet encountered a scene of devastation and chaos. A massive convoy of alien vessels, numbering at least 50 ships of various sizes and configurations, was engaged in a desperate battle against an even larger hostile force. The attackers numbered over 150 vessels, and they bore down on the convoy with overwhelming numerical superiority. The defending ships were taking damage rapidly, their defensive screens flickering under sustained assault. Explosions bloomed across the void like deadly flowers, and debris scattered in all directions. Captain Marcus Patterson stared at the tactical display in stunned silence for only a moment before his military training took over. He immediately opened a communications channel to all vessels in the human fleet. The situation was clear. A smaller force was being overwhelmed by a larger one, and if the humans did not intervene immediately, everyone in that convoy would be destroyed within hours. Marcus issued the order to move into combat position. The Sentinel accelerated toward the conflict zone, its weapon systems coming online. The response from the convoy's command structure came through barely a moment later. A crystalline being identified itself as Vorath, the commanding officer of what it called the Collective Assembly. The creature's form appeared almost ethereal, composed of translucent geometric structures that refracted light in patterns that hurt to look at directly. Vorath expressed shock and confusion at the arrival of the human fleet, followed immediately by desperate gratitude. The translator systems worked overtime to process the complex communication patterns of the alien entity, but the message was clear. Vorath wanted to know who humanity was and why they were offering assistance to complete strangers. Marcus introduced himself and his command, explaining that humanity had received the distress call and responded according to their principles and protocols. Vorath seemed momentarily stunned by this explanation. The commanding officer of the Collective Assembly explained that the distress beacon had been activated days ago by various member species, but none of them had held any real hope that anyone would answer. The galaxy, Vorath explained, was dominated by certain military powers, and most civilizations had learned to hide rather than call for help. The fact that an unknown species had traveled vast distances to aid them suggested something fundamentally different about humanity. The attacking force, according to Vorath, was the Dominion Empire, a brutal military state that had conquered vast territories across the galaxy through systematic conquest and subjugation. The Collective Assembly had attempted to maintain peace through isolation and strategic retreat, but the Dominion had recently begun expanding into regions that the Collective considered vital to their survival. The current assault was an attempt to destroy the Collective once and for all, to eliminate them as a threat and as a symbol of resistance to Dominion rule. Marcus made the decision instantly. The human fleet would engage the Dominion forces and attempt to turn the tide of battle. The tactical situation was still dire, but humanity's intervention had already shifted the balance of probability. As Marcus issued the attack orders, the Sentinel and its accompanying warships moved into position, and the first salvo of human missiles screamed through the darkness of space toward their targets. The initial barrage from the human fleet took the Dominion forces completely by surprise. Advanced human missiles, equipped with multiple targeting systems and plasma warheads, struck the enemy's formation with devastating precision. 3 Dominion destroyers were disabled in the first volley, their shields overwhelmed by the sheer magnitude of the assault. The human fleet had not hesitated or attempted any form of warning or negotiation. They had arrived and immediately committed to combat with an aggression that the Dominion had never encountered before. Captain Gregory Wells, commanding the Sentinel, from the bridge, executed a series of complex tactical maneuvers that took advantage of the three-dimensional nature of space combat. Human military doctrine, developed over decades of deep space operations, emphasized speed, coordination, and overwhelming force projection. The 3 destroyer-class vessels flanked the Dominion battleships, while the Sentinel moved to intercept the command vessel of the hostile fleet. Vincent Drake coordinated the attack patterns, his tactical genius evident in every decision he made. The human ships moved with a fluidity and precision that belied their size and mass. The Dominion commander, a brutal warlord named Vexthor, had conquered over 30 star systems through military might. He had never encountered a resistance force that could match his fleet's capabilities. As his vessels took damage and began to fall back, Vexthor realized that he was facing an opponent unlike any he had encountered in his long military career. The humans fought with a ferocity and coordination that seemed to come naturally to them. Their pilots demonstrated reflexes that appeared almost superhuman, and their tactical formations exploited every weakness in the Dominion's defensive posture. The young pilots of the human interceptor wings displayed the advantages that came from being born on Earth, a world with high gravity and harsh environmental conditions that had shaped human physiology over millions of years. Their reflexes were sharper, their tolerance for extreme G-forces greater, and their combat instincts honed by a world that had always demanded survival of the fittest. As they maneuvered their sleek fighter craft through the wreckage and debris of space, they outmaneuvered Dominion pilots, who were more accustomed to fighting against lesser opponents. Within the first hour of sustained combat, the Dominion had lost 23 ships while the human fleet had suffered only minor damage to the Phoenix and the Valor. The collective assembly vessels, seeing that their attackers could be hurt, began to regain confidence. They mounted their own counteroffensive, coordinating their movements with the human warships in a display of cooperation that surprised everyone involved. The aliens of the collective assembly had feared they were facing their final hours, and now they found themselves fighting alongside an unknown ally that seemed to revel in combat. As the battle continued, the tide turned decisively in favor of the combined force. Vexthor recognized that he was being defeated, a realization that must have been bitter indeed for a commander who had never known failure. He issued the order for his fleet to break off engagement and begin a tactical retreat. The Dominion vessels accelerated away from the conflict zone, leaving their damaged and disabled ships behind as they fled. Within moments, the void around the collective assembly was quiet once more, and the battle had ended as suddenly as it had begun. Captain Marcus Patterson ordered a temporary stand-down of weapons and issued orders that the human vessels move into positions adjacent to the damaged collective assembly ships. Emergency medical personnel and repair crews were dispatched to provide assistance. Dr. Patricia Lawson coordinated the transfer of wounded aliens to human medical bays, a process that required careful calibration to ensure that the alien physiology would not reject the medical technology and treatments. The compassion displayed by the human crew seemed to affect the collective assembly deeply. These were beings who had expected only death, and instead they had found salvation at the hands of strangers from a species they had never heard of until hours before. The meeting between human command staff and the leadership of the collective assembly took place in the main conference room of the Sentinel. Vorath attended along with several other representatives of the collective, each from different species and bringing different perspectives to the Alliance. The crystalline commander explained the history of the Dominion in careful detail, painting a picture of a brutal military regime that had existed for over 500 years. The Dominion Empire, according to Vorath, had spent centuries conquering and subjugating civilizations across multiple sectors of space. They viewed mercy as weakness and compassion as a failing of inferior species. The collective assembly had managed to avoid direct conflict for nearly 2 centuries through careful diplomacy, strategic isolation, and the maintenance of neutral territories that no faction could claim. However, recent economic and strategic developments had forced them to expand into regions that the Dominion considered part of their sphere of influence. This expansion had been viewed as an act of rebellion, and the Dominion had responded with military force. The aliens of the collective expressed profound gratitude for humanity's intervention, but they also expressed concern about the long-term implications of what had occurred. The Dominion would not forget this defeat, and they would certainly send reinforcements to deal with the threat that humanity represented. Vexthor had managed to escape with the majority of his fleet intact, which meant he would now be fleeing back to Dominion space to request support from his superiors. Admiral Linda Hayes, communicating from Earth via encrypted quantum relay, received detailed reports of the battle and the diplomatic situation. After consulting with the United Nations Security Council and the International Space Force Command, she issued new directives to Captain Marcus Patterson. The United Nations authorized full support for the collective assembly in their conflict with the Dominion. However, the intelligence analysis coming from Earth's military strategists painted a troubling picture. The Dominion would likely send reinforcements within 3 to 7 days, and those reinforcements would be significantly larger than the initial attack force. The human fleet and the collective assembly forces faced a critical decision. They could attempt to flee deeper into uncontrolled space, seeking refuge in areas where the Dominion's reach might not extend. Alternatively, they could prepare to make a stand and defend the territory they currently occupied. A tactical analysis suggested that flight would only delay the inevitable. The Dominion would pursue them across the galaxy until the collective was finally cornered and destroyed. Marcus proposed a third option to the assembled leadership of both humanity and the collective assembly. He suggested that they use the time before the Dominion reinforcements arrived to prepare the strongest possible defense. They could reinforce their position, share technology and tactical information, and coordinate their military forces into a unified fighting force. More importantly, they could send a message throughout the galaxy that the price of attacking peaceful peoples and those who defended them was far too high. Marcus believed that such a message could shift the balance of power in the galactic political landscape. Vorath considered this proposal carefully, consulting with the other members of the collective assembly through channels of communication that humans could not fully comprehend. After what seemed like an eternity, Vorath offered the agreement of the collective. They would make their stand alongside humanity. The ancient words of a human military strategist from Earth's past, known as Sun Tzu, seemed to apply to the moment. The supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting. However, this situation would likely require fighting. But perhaps the unity displayed here would send a message that would ripple through galactic civilization. Vincent Drake immediately began formulating defensive strategies, working with collective military officers to identify the most strategically advantageous positions for their combined fleet. The asteroid field near the wormhole junction that Vorath had identified seemed to offer excellent defensive positions. The terrain would allow them to utilize their superior tactical knowledge to create choke points and defensive advantages that would offset the numerical superiority of the incoming Dominion forces. 3 days of frantic preparation followed the decision to make their stand. The combined human and collective fleet worked around the clock to fortify their position within the asteroid field. Repair crews labored to restore damaged vessels to combat readiness, while engineers established defensive networks and communication systems that would allow the unified force to coordinate its actions with split-second precision. The humans shared technology with their new allies, providing them with tactical displays and communication protocols that had been refined through decades of human military development. The third day arrived, and with it came the arrival of the Dominion reinforcements. The detection systems of the combined fleet registered over 300 Dominion warships emerging from faster-than-light space, accompanied by support vessels and supply ships. The numbers seemed overwhelming, and several collective officers expressed doubt about the viability of their defensive strategy. However, Marcus and Vincent Drake remained calm and confident. They had prepared thoroughly, and they had faith in their combined fighting force. The Dominion commander overseeing the reinforcements was a ruthless officer named Casthal, known throughout Dominion space for his successful campaigns of conquest. He believed that the 300 ships under his command would easily overcome any resistance the combined human and collective forces could mount. He issued orders for the fleet to approach the asteroid field and begin a methodical destruction of the enemy forces. The Dominion assault began with a massive barrage of energy weapons, but the asteroids of the field absorbed much of the damage, and the defensive positions that Vincent Drake had identified proved far more effective than expected. The battle that followed was the most intense and devastating conflict that either humans or collective members had ever experienced. Ships maneuvered through the complex three-dimensional terrain of the asteroid field, using gravitational fields and debris for cover. The human pilots, with their superior reflexes and combat instincts, proved deadly opponents. The collective forces, fighting for their very survival and inspired by the courage of their human allies, displayed a tactical brilliance that surprised even their Dominion attackers. The turning point came when Marcus identified the location of Casthal's flagship and coordinated a combined assault by human bombers and collective attack vessels. The assault was a calculated risk, and for a moment it seemed as though it might fail. However, the flagship's defenses were overwhelmed, and the vessel was struck by a massive barrage of combined weapons fire. The explosion that followed was visible across the entire battlefield, and it seemed to shake the morale of the entire Dominion force. Vexthor, recovering from his previous defeat and present with the reinforcement fleet, made a desperate decision. He called for a final massive assault, ordering all remaining Dominion vessels to converge on the human and collective defensive position. The assault was brutal and uncompromising, and for a moment it seemed as though the combined forces might be overwhelmed by sheer numbers. However, the humans and their collective allies stood firm. They fought with a determination that seemed almost superhuman, refusing to yield despite the overwhelming odds against them. The turning point came when the human pilots of the interceptor wings conducted a daring strike against Vexthor's damaged flagship. The vessel had been weakened by previous combat, and it was now the focus of a coordinated assault by dozens of human fighter craft. The defenses of the flagship failed under the sustained barrage, and a massive explosion tore the vessel apart. Vexthor, the warlord who had thought himself invincible, perished in that explosion, and with his death came the beginning of the end for the Dominion assault. The Dominion fleet, suddenly bereft of its most skilled commanders and facing a determined enemy that refused to break, began to disintegrate as a cohesive fighting force. Ships began fleeing the battlefield, accelerating away from the asteroid field and attempting to escape to Dominion space. Within hours, the battle was effectively over. The Dominion forces had been routed, and the combined human and collective fleet held the field of battle. The aftermath of the conflict was one of cautious celebration and urgent recovery. Ships of both fleets had suffered significant damage and many had been destroyed. The medical facilities were overwhelmed with wounded from both species. Dr. Patricia Lawson worked tirelessly, coordinating medical personnel to ensure that both humans and aliens received the care they needed. The losses had been severe, but they had been acceptable and, more importantly, they had been victorious. In the days that followed, formal diplomatic relations were established between humanity and the collective assembly. Vorath announced to the galaxy through official channels that humanity, previously unknown to most civilizations outside their immediate stellar region, had proven themselves to be worthy of respect and alliance. The humans began to be known throughout galactic civilization as the Deathworlders, a reference to their origins on a world that had shaped them through harsh environmental pressures and natural selection. This name carried connotations of strength, resilience, and capability. Messages of support and interest began flowing in from dozens of other species and civilizations. Beings who had previously hidden from Dominion oppression now saw an opportunity to emerge from their hiding places and engage in open trade and diplomatic relations. More importantly, they recognized in humanity a species that valued compassion and individual freedom, qualities that had become rare in the broader galactic community. Species that had been enslaved or oppressed by the Dominion began reaching out to the collective assembly, seeking to establish relationships with both the collective and with humanity. Captain Marcus Patterson stood on the bridge of the Sentinel, observing the vast network of interstellar space that surrounded his vessel. Incoming messages flowed across the communications channels, expressions of gratitude and respect from civilizations that humans had never heard of before. The Earth Defense Command was processing requests for trade agreements, diplomatic missions, and cultural exchanges. The young species from the third planet of a relatively unremarkable star system had announced itself to the galactic community not through conquest or domination, but through courage, compassion, and an unwillingness to turn away from those in need. A new chapter in human history had begun. The isolation of humanity was at an end, and the long journey toward understanding and cooperation with the broader galactic civilization had commenced. The Deathworlders had arrived on the galactic stage, and they had done so with a message that would echo across the stars. Humanity would stand for those who could not stand for themselves.